Welcome. Thank you all for being here today, whether you're here in the auditorium in Washington, D.C., or joining us via our live stream. For our online audience, I encourage you all to join the conversation on social media and invite your friends to tune in now. Please share your reflections and your questions on Facebook and Twitter using the hashtag AskWhy or hashtag USHMM. This is the first of the museum's two-part series, Hate and Its Impact. Hate is obviously a huge topic. One of our key goals at the museum is to educate people about history and help them understand hate and anti-Semitism, which is a particular form of hatred. Anti-Semitism was around a long time before the Nazis came to power, and it will continue long after them. Hate is resilient, anti-Semitism is resilient, and takes on many different forms. It thrives in societies that are religious, those that are secular, capitalist, communist, and in bad economic times, and even in those times that are prosperous. Since hate and anti-Semitism are not going to go away, it's important to understand the different kinds. What conditions make it flourish, and when they are most dangerous. And even to ask ourselves, maybe this is the most important thing, what is our role in creating environments in which they can't spread? It's an honor now to introduce our expert panelist. First of all, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt. She is the Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory University. She's a former member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council, and she's a current member of our academic committee and the Committee on Holocaust Denial and State-Sponsored Antisemitism. Deborah is a well-known historian and prolific author, I'm sure known to most of you. She may be most well-known for her success in the lawsuit brought against her by Holocaust denier David Irving, which was later made into a major motion picture, Denial. Deborah's latest book, Antisemitism Here and Now, was just published, and I'm happy to let you know that she will be signing copies of it in the lobby after this program. Many of you already tried to sneak in to get her to sign before the program, but I assure you she'll be around afterwards. Richard Allen Greene is a senior news editor for CNN. He has reported on religion and politics, and prior to joining CNN, he worked at Politico, the BBC, and the Prague Post. Richard currently runs CNN's London news desk, and he was the editorial lead for CNN's A Shadow Over Europe, Antisemitism in 2018. Brendan Murphy is a history teacher at the Marist School in Atlanta, Georgia. He's been teaching students, parents, and the larger community about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust for more than 2 decades. Brendan is the director of Bearing Witness, an in-depth educational program that includes an annual trip for his students to Munich, Prague, and Krakow. Brendan is a Lerner Fellow with the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, and he's one of our own museum teacher fellows. Finally, to guide our conversation today, I'd like to welcome our moderator, David Gregory. David is an analyst and contributor for CNN. He spent nearly 20 years at NBC News, serving as the chief White House correspondent and host of Meet the Press. David is the author of How's Your Faith?, a memoir about his faith journey amid the rough and tumble of today's news environment. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn the program over now to David.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. I'm usually good with remembering the microphone. Thank you all for being here with us. Thank you for those who are watching the stream and who will participate in this discussion. And we want you to participate in the discussion. What we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation on this topic, which is, a little bit of a downer. But at least we have a movie star here who's, I always thought you say best known for being a movie star. That's what you're best known for. Something that the rest of us cannot say. We're going to have a discussion, and then we're going to take some questions from you. You can also submit questions online following the stream, and post your questions at hashtag USHMM or hashtag AskWhy. So that's how the conversation will go online. I'm pleased to be here and participating in this because it's something kind of unusual in our popular culture, which is a chance to speak more deeply with an intention of seeking and searching for a deeper understanding about something that's very difficult. The history of anti-Semitism, the reality of anti-Semitism, what it is, what it isn't, why it divides us in some of our current debates, and a chance to have a fair conversation, a conversation that is really meant to give a deeper understanding as we continue our own journeys into the world. And that's how we'll approach it. We'll look at really understanding what anti-Semitism is, its history, its origins, its particular role in Nazi Germany. But then, very much on the topic of Deborah's really compelling new book, is understanding anti-Semitism here and now. How do we talk about it? How do we understand it? And how, this is my interest, how do we decouple it from very toxic conversation, particularly in social media, about hatred today? So that's our goal, and we're happy to have you here, and we're eager to get started. So Deborah, let's get started. How do we understand anti-Semitism? What is it? One of the great things about your book is that you're in conversation with students. And there's a lot of discussion about anti-Semitism as if we really understand what it is.
Well, on some level, it's a task that can't really be accomplished, figuring out what it is, because we're talking about a prejudice, and a prejudice prejudge is essentially irrational. I made up my mind based on what you are, about who you are, before I even know you. You know, the prejudice meets you 5 feet ahead of the person walking down the street. So on some level, to explain it is to give a rational explanation to something that's irrational. Having said that, let me try to explain it. There's the famous, for those who, the difficulty in explaining it, and some people rely on probably one of the most famous quotes to come out of the Supreme Court, Potter Stewart's, you know, I can't, talking about pornography, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. Many people will say, I know anti-Semitism when I see it, especially Jews, when it hits me. But I think there's more to it than that. Somewhat jocularly, either the great scholar Isaiah Berlin, the Lithuanian-born British scholar, or I was told it's from a Hungarian novel. I don't know the source of this, but an anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than is absolutely necessary. Now, that may sound amusing, and when I tell my students, they all wonder, can we laugh? And I say, yes, you can laugh, so you can laugh too. But think about it. Think about it first, let's say in terms of racism. You're driving on the highway and somebody comes in and swerves and you're knocked off the road, and clearly they've done it just to push you off the road. You don't know these people, it's not road rage, nothing. They just decide to push you off the road. You get home and you're completely shaken, and people at home ask what happened, and you say, a driver almost killed me, knocked me off the road, the car is totaled, but I'm okay. That's one thing. But if you get home and you say, a black driver knocked me off the road, that's racism, because that's unnecessary. If the police officer comes up and says, I saw what happened, describe the driver, and you say it was an African American, that's a different story, then it's relevant. So if you hate someone and you just hate them, that's fine. Jews hate each other all the time. Go to a synagogue board meeting, you know, and you'll see it, and I say that only half in jest. But if you hate them more, then you're dealing with anti-Semitism. And we can get even more specific than that. Anti-Semitism has a structure. It has what I say 3 essential elements. Something to do with money, with finances, something to do with power, and something to do with intellect. But all 3 of them used in a nefarious, malicious, diabolical way. So it's not just having money, but using it to get your way at the expense of others. I would say that to a great degree, this has its roots in the New Testament and the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, because as the way the story has often been told, that the Jews wanted Jesus killed. Of course, Jesus was a Jew, but that's irrelevant to the story, of the way the story has been taught. The Jews wanted Jesus killed because he wanted to chase the money changers out of the temple. So you have, power and money, and they got Rome. They connived. Using their smarts, they convinced Rome, the most powerful entity in the world, to do this, even though it deprived the rest of the world of the wonder of this God figure, this godlike figure, the Son of God.
Can I just interject one point? I want to bring in Brendan on this. This element of power, the idea that Jews just aren't an enemy, they're the ultimate enemy.
Yeah, right.
Dig into that a little bit more.
Well, first, let me just say for a moment what a privilege it is for me to be here today. And Richard would agree to be sitting here with Professor Lipstadt is an extraordinary honor. I mean, she, of course, is one of the foremost historians, the foremost historian on anti-Semitism. I mean, as you mentioned, there's
One of,
yes. I mean, there's been a movie made about her, and she'll be signing books after the event. And as a high school teacher, I'll be signing detention slips for everybody who's chewing gum in the audience today. But one of the common threads that runs throughout the fabric of this long and tragic history of anti-Semitism is this terribly simple question of why. Why the Jews? Where does this come from? And I know that, Professor Lipstadt, you find this question to be problematic in many levels, but it's a question that, of course, our students ask all the time. And to get at that question, I think you have to trace the origins of it, right? You have to be able to understand where we begin to find the first historical evidence of a real hatred towards the Jews because of their Jewishness. And I think if you can identify where it happens and when it happens, and you can leverage the skills of an historian to analyze the historical context to understand, of course, then why it's happening, right? And when you do that, you begin to find some of the first traces of a hostility towards the Jews that dates as far back as the classical world of ancient Greece and Rome and Persia. And it appears to be a hostility based on the unique difference that the Jews presented to their neighbors. They were different. They were unique. In a polytheistic world, there was something of a relative ecumenical approach to faith where one could recognize a measure of equality among different deities. For the Greeks, Zeus was the Roman Jupiter, Athena, Minerva, Aphrodite, Venus, etc. But for the Jews, who had developed this tradition of ethical monotheism, they could not accept that their God was the same as everyone else's. And so they were different. And so you then begin to see some hostilities develop. But things changed dramatically and tragically in the first century with the rise of Christianity, for the very reason that Professor Lipstadt was highlighting. A hostility develops towards the Jews, not because they're different, but because, in fact, they're dangerous. And they're perceived then as something of a nefarious threat.
See some of the images as you're talking that accompany that notion.
Right. And that view towards Jews, of course, is carried right into the modern age, of course.
Can I just follow on this
yes,
point,
please.
just on the kind of the theology of it for Christians? So Jesus is a Jew. There's the issue of money changers outside the temple and whatnot, but it's also the appeals made to Pontius Pilate and so forth. That's about faith, right? The notion of the Messiah being Jesus Christ, right? Can you talk about all of that and how that animus builds?
Well, early Christian theologians will develop the idea that is known in academic circles as this myth of deicide. Again, that the Jews are responsible for the death of Christ. And they'll carry this idea, if you can imagine, so far as to say that the Jews killed Christ because they knew who he was, the Son of God. That was the motivation behind this act. And you see this in the writings of people like Chrysostom and Melito of Sardis and others in these early centuries. And with that, there's an enormous fallout as a result, of terrible consequence, of course. And it begins to develop this tradition of Christian anti-Judaism that lasts, of course, for centuries. One of the consequences of that, of course, is that the Jews are identified with this extraordinary evil, Satan, the devil, if you will. And secondly, it also leads to this idea that because of this terrible act, because the Jews had killed Christ, the covenant forged with God centuries earlier has now been broken and has now been passed to a new people, the Christians. This myth of supersession becomes central to Christian self-understanding. And here you see an image from the Strasbourg Cathedral, known as ecclesia and synagoga. Ecclesia shown on your left, and synagoga to your right. And you can see ecclesia, of course, is crowned. She is shown triumphant, and she comes to symbolize the church, the triumph of the Catholic or the Christian church. Synagoga, as you see, is quite different. She is downtrodden, dejected, blindfolded, blinded to the truth, as it were. Her staff, the symbol of authority, is broken, suggesting this idea, again, that Christianity has superseded Judaism. And these are the foundations that will build a tradition, this myth of deicide and supersession, that will build a tradition of Christian anti-Judaism that will last again to the modern era.
Yeah, go ahead. All of you guys, jump in. I want to get Richard
I
in here.
think, Brendan, you're saying something very important, and if we go back to that slide, the previous shot, but the Jew is not just an enemy.
Correct, that's right.
The Jew is the enemy.
Right.
And you almost need the Jew to prop up your belief. So as you said it to me earlier in conversation, the Jew becomes the devil. Yeah. The only one with the power to possibly harm God, impact God. So it's not just a bad person or a bad group of people, but the dangerous people.
And Richard, can I bring you in on this? Because what we see in history is at times anti-Semitism is marginalized, it's on the fringes, other times it's more mainstream. That's the dynamic, this kind of ebb and flow.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason that I was invited to be on the panel today is because at CNN we've just been researching levels of contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe. On the heels of the headline-making events that we all hear about, you know, when there is a shooting at a museum in Belgium, or when a kosher supermarket is attacked, we all hear about that. But for those of us who cover it day in, day out, there is a base level of, you know, daily anti-Semitism, whether that is verbal abuse, or whether it's somebody's, you know, kippah being knocked off, or whether it's online abuse on Twitter or wherever else it comes. And we have noticed that the sort of background level, which is always there, in the past couple of years has risen. So organizations that track anti-Semitic acts in Europe for a long time saw a correlation between violence in the Middle East and attacks on Jews in Europe. So when there's violence in Gaza and Israel and the Palestinians have a flare-up, then there are attacks on Jews. The past couple of years, that link has been broken, and the average level has risen. So in England, for example, the Community Security Trust, which monitors attacks on Jews in the UK, just reported that last year was the highest number of attacks on Jews recorded in a single year, and it was the third year in a row where they said that. So what we wanted to look into is where this is coming from, you know, these beliefs. You know, I don't think that we assume that the average person who is, you know, insulting somebody on Twitter believes that it's because the Jews killed Christ. But do they continue to believe that, you know, Jews, you know, clanishly in some conspiratorial way control the media, or control politics in their country, or control banking and finance, you know, these old Jewish myths. And it was interesting when we tried to separate the question, we asked the pollsters' equivalent of a straightforward, do you dislike Jews? And across Europe, if you ask the question as simply as that, we surveyed 7 countries, about 10% of people were willing to say flat out, I don't like Jews. But when we pushed into the stereotypes that we talked about, these ancient anti-Semitic tropes, do Jewish people have too much influence on political affairs? 1 out of 5 people in Europe who we surveyed across these 7 countries said, yes, Jewish people, in some conspiratorial way, have too much influence.
And it's interesting because in our political dialogue today, we talk a lot about elites in the country. Democrats today are talking about all kinds of measures to tax the wealthiest in the country, kind of beyond the idea of simple progressive taxation, getting into taxing billionaires and so on and so forth. So we throw around the idea of elites, Deborah, and in that structure of anti-Semitism, the notion of Jews as elites who are the ultimate enemy, but it's ironic because they're always small in number and they wield a disproportionate amount of influence.
One of the best ways of getting at that is to do a comparison between the racist and the anti-Semite, often the same person, but that's for another conversation, or maybe this one. The racist looks at the person of color and sees someone who is lesser than, someone who's going to destroy the white race, bring down the white race, such as the person who was just arrested a few days ago or yesterday here locally, or the person at the Pittsburgh synagogue who went to shoot Jews because they were helping refugees who were going to destroy the white race, and Jews, of course, were not white either. So but the racist sees the person of color as, and these are stereotypes, and I put it in very big quotation marks, polluting pure white culture because they'll bring it down. Just think, in this building, part of the exhibit is about the 1936 Olympics. And Americans all know Jesse Owens because we like to say his 4 Olympic gold medals, his athletic feat, and F-E-A-T or F-E-E-T, either one, were an answer to the Nazis. We like that because it makes our participation a noble thing. The truth of the matter is, how did the Germans explain Jesse Owens' accomplishments? They said he's a black man of African origin, so on their pseudoscientific, non-scientific, anti-scientific scale of humans, he's closer to an animal than a person, and therefore no Aryan could have beat him because an animal is still faster than an Aryan. So you bring him down. The Jew is seen as the elite, the globalist, the financial interest, and they're smarter than, in a conniving way, richer than, more powerful than, but always in a conniving way, and they're going to bring us down by taking control of us, by replacing us. So the anti-Semite is punching up, and the racist is punching down. So it's a different perspective, both nefarious, both evil, both dangerous, but different.
And, we see over the sweep of history, right? So theologically, the notion of chosenness, which is controversial even in Jewish theological circles, how we assert the notion of chosenness. But at least in the Bible, there it is. And then in the more modern, political history, you have a political nationhood movement of Zionism that is successful in ways that lots of other movements were not. Mm-hmm. That are factual. Or this piece is a factual movement that plays into people saying, yeah, this is a group that is small but has a lot of power and influence.
True. I mean, Jews have been very successful, and I once heard a scholar and a person who's a very proud Jew say, but do you know any parent who would say to a kid as they're going off for their freshman year at whatever university, now don't succeed too much, because if you're at the top of the dean's list, it's going to cause anti-Semitism. Jews have been successful, but there are also Jews who have not been successful. But the problem is when the person is a Jew, we look at that. If the person is a blonde person, You know, we don't say, oh, blondes are too successful or whatever it might be. Here's where you run into that trick of that, trying to find a rational reason. Sometimes people will say to me, now, wasn't Hitler's mother ill, and wasn't the doctor who didn't save her or refused to treat her or whatever, wasn't he Jewish? And first I say that's a myth, but second of all, even if it's true, so what? What if that doctor had been left-handed? Would Hitler have gone on in a campaign to destroy all left-handed people? So that's where, going back to my original comment, you get this trying to explain something that's irrational, rational.
So, and I just want to put this definition out there. This is from your book, because part of the dialogue in your book is, can you actually come up with a definition? And one of the ones you settle on, a persisting latent structure of hostile beliefs toward Jews as a collectivity manifested by individuals as attitudes, and in culture as myth, ideology, folklore, and imagery, and in action, social or legal discrimination, political mobilization against Jews, and collective or state violence, which results in or is designed to distance, displace, or destroy Jews as Jews. I think we got it now. Go ahead, Brendan, you want to make a point?
I was just going to ask Professor Lipstadt if here we're talking about in contemporary anti-Semitism, you find this belief among anti-Semites that Jews are part of this sort of vast conspiracy working behind the scenes in some nefarious way as sort of a shadow group. Do you find parallels with that in early Christianity, for example, with this idea of deicide?
Yes, I mean, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And I don't want to always link it to early Christianity because it seems to take the atheist, the left, the person on the left, the communist, the whatever, off the hook. Right. The intriguing and horrifying thing about anti-Semitism is this template, which I described and you described and you added so much to, has the template remains the same, whether it's in the hands of the church father, or it's in the hands of a Karl Marx, or in the hands of a Wilhelm Marr in the latter, who invented the word antisemitism in Vienna at the end of the 19th century, or of the Nazi, or of the person who doesn't want the Jew in the country club, or, you know, it's the same prototype. It can be linked to religion, or it can be completely cut off from it.
Could you show the image of the blood libel that we have in the slide here? Because I wanted to ask Professor if you find something conspiratorial in this as well, right? So here you have an image of a young Christian boy, Simon, from Trent in Italy, and he was murdered, the story goes, and the Jewish community there in Trent was blamed for his murder. They were accused of ritually murdering him, draining his blood, this infamous blood libel accusation, one of thousands of accusations that were made against Jews throughout the course of the late medieval period. And some Christian writers went on to say that among the reasons why Jews participate in this blood libel, this ritual murder, is because, in a sense, they're trying to effect their own salvation by participating in the sacraments, by ingesting the blood of Christian children, right? Because the Christian belief is that we participate in the sacraments by ingesting the blood of Christ, which affects our salvation. And so do you find some parallels with that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, what's being done here is a reenactment of the crucifixion.
That's right.
Even though in the crucifixion story, it's the Romans who actually crucify Jesus, but they're reenacting it. But they're more than reenacting it. They posed an immediate danger to you and your children. Their attempt to observe this ritual, this ingesting of the blood of Christ, which shows that they really know that Christ is God.
Exactly, right.
But they're hiding it. They know it. And yet, at the same time, you put your children out there, and if they're about, you're in danger. You face a danger. So the Jew becomes a theological enemy and an immediate danger to the most vulnerable amongst you. That's right. In the ancient times, in the times of the Romans, in the first century, in Jesus, and then our innocent children ever since.
Let me just issue a reminder. If you have questions, we'll get to that in a little while. You can write them down on the index cards, and there's folks who will pass them out and give them to me, and we'll have that opportunity. Richard, any thoughts on this as we're talking about?
Well, I was going to say, one of the questions that we asked when we surveyed to try and, I mean, obviously, I don't think we're going to get a lot of people who say they believe in the blood libel anymore, but within the internal logic of anti-Semitism, there is a reason, if you are an anti-Semite, if you believe this, then there is a reason to hate Jews because they've killed Christ and because they're killing our children. And the link that I would draw to that in the findings that we made is we asked what people thought the reason for contemporary anti-Semitism was, who was to blame for contemporary anti-Semitism, and we found about 1 out of 5 people said it was a response to the everyday behavior of Jewish people. So who is responsible for anti-Semitism? The Jews are responsible because of how they act, because of what they do. That is that's
It's like
today.
saying women are responsible for rape
Right.
because they go out on the street, and that.
And we'll get to the question of Israel as, a cause of anti-Semitism. But before we do that, I want to come back. This question of then how anti-Semitism becomes state policy in Nazi Germany. So, Deborah, the one question is this belief that fuels Nazism, that is historical, right, in its mythology. But the other question at the same time is seeking an answer to what has happened to us, right, after World War I, and whom do we blame?
Well, you have to find someone to blame who makes sense, and the person you're blaming has to make sense to the general public. One of the jokes that was supposedly told, and I have it in the book. There are a lot of jokes in the book too. Someone said, "How could anybody get jokes into a book on anti-Semitism?" I managed, but one of the jokes that was told. Apparently by Jews in Germany in the 30s was, the Nazi leader who comes and gives a harangue, the Jews are our misfortune, the Jews did this, the Jews did that, and somebody else, and the bicycle riders. And he looks at the person, he says, "Why the bicycle riders?" And the person who yelled it out says, "Why the Jews?" In other words, it makes no sense, but the person will believe it. If I say, I've lost my job, or I've lost my reasonable apartment, where I've lived for years because they're knocking it down and they're building a big complex for very wealthy people, which is happening in many cities, etc. And I say it's a Jewish development, the Jewish developers. They don't care about us, and they're throwing me out. I'm one of the small people, gentrification, etc. It makes sense because you've heard this all these years. You've heard it for millennia as both, and you hear it now, as you were saying. If you were to say, "Oh, it's a conspiracy of the left-handed people against me," we'd say, "We're going to get you to the local psychiatric hospital as soon as possible." So, it makes sense.
And the Nazis believed what?
The Nazis believed, I don't know whether they believed it or they knew they had a good thing in using it. I don't want to sometimes give them credit for having a coherent, but they knew that if they kept harping, Goebbels kept harping, repeat this, the Jew is our misfortune. The Jew brought us down in World War I. The Jew stabbed us in the back, nefarious. The Jew got the world against us. The Jew, the Jew, the Jew. I mean, we've had exhibits in this museum on propaganda, and there still are, in the permanent exhibit, et cetera. But you were saying something that made sense to people. And therefore, I have to find someone to blame, and it makes sense that these are the people.
But in this case, in Hitler's mind, describe the elements that were at work, right? The world politics, the world economy, all controlled by Jews.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you feel that Nazi propaganda didn't necessarily educate or otherwise create anti-Semites, but instead it just stoked or
I think it stoked.
stirred? Yeah.
It stoked and it created. It did both. It stoked on something that was there, And it created, with persistent images such as this, with children's books, with, it's replete.
Because Deborah, a lot of the comment, right? The accusations that were like a lot of Jews were communists, right? So if you look at the revolution,
You can blame what Jews were communists, Jews were capitalists. It didn't matter. I mean, you have the famous Nazi propaganda film, The Eternal Jew, where they showed the wealthy Jews in Berlin, drinking champagne and sitting very comfortably. Didn't matter. Logic was not part of it. I am going to show you this Jew is, here we go, der ewige Jude, the eternal Jew. This Jew is disgusting, and this Jew is dangerous.
And that's how they always have been.
And
Hence the
they've
name.
always been like that, and they continue to be like that. Religious, communist, you see the hammer and sickle, they are going to somehow harm us, and we must act against them.
and there were famous German philosophers who believed that there was something organically German, that it was actually something that could be spoiled in some fashion.
Well, that goes back to the pseudoscience of, when the people in Charlottesville were chanting blood and soil. We all knew what they were saying when they were saying Jews will not replace us. That's the replacement theory, that Jews are working to replace whites, etc. But blood and soil, Blut und Boden, is a traditional Nazi chant. Many of the people in this audience know that Jews are not of our blood and not of this soil. They are cosmopolitans. They are more closely connected to a Jew in another country than a Jew in our country. They are not of us. Scientifically, theologically, emotionally, politically, they are other and they are dangerous. Dangerous images, right?
Other comment?
I mean, the pictures speak for themselves, right? I mean, this is the line of the image that we've seen from the blood libel traces directly into this. You change the captions and you've got the same images.
And Brendan, this is a good point, I think, to bring up the origins of the swastika and how that actually comes to be.
Well, my understanding is that, there are different understandings or interpretations, rather, of how the swastika came to be. Now, of course, it appears that it did predate Hitler's joining of the Nazi Party, right, prior to the 1920s. But in some ways, it's a variation of the Christian cross. We find this in some medieval churches, this sort of depiction of the cross this way. There are myriad global examples, cross-cultural, cross-international examples through history of this particular image being used in even pre-Columbian Native American cultures, Hindu cultures as well. Of course, it means something entirely different than what the Nazis embraced. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that in the archaeological remains of the ancient Aryans, there were images of swastikas found. We don't know what that meant, but
we don't know
this
what
was
it
the main
meant.
reason why it was adopted.
Hindus consider the swastika as a holy symbol that has been stolen from them.
Right.
But it's what it became and what it symbolized. And it became something that was pervasive, and this is our protection. This is our symbol, but this is also an example of what we are and the Jew is not.
Deborah, what about this question as we bring it into the present and where anti-Semitism is rearing its head today? The notion of it being on the fringe versus something that's more mainstream. How do you view that, not just in modern Europe, but in the United States as well?
I think if you had asked me that question a year ago, I might have given you a different answer. Look, things changed a lot, certainly for many Americans, but not just Americans, with Pittsburgh. And I was interviewed the day of Pittsburgh, I think by a reporter from the Times, and she asked me, well, what's your reaction? I said, I'm shocked, but I'm not surprised. Anybody who has studied this and studied what's been going on and studied the vindictive language and the separation and the extremism that we've seen in this country would not be surprised, shocked at the extent and shocked that it happened, of course. But today, I think we see anti-Semitism on both the right and the left. And one of the things I argue in the book is that many people only see it on the other side of the political transom from where they reside. So if I'm on the left, I'm quick to see it on the right. And if I'm on the right, I'm quick to see it on the left. Hello, it's on both sides.
Right.
And it's very strong on both sides.
And Richard, you've mentioned some of the results of the survey that CNN did about modern attitudes about Jews, about anti-Semitism. So bring us up to speed then on that.
Well, I mean, I think what we assume is that for every incident, certainly not just the ones as terrible as Pittsburgh, but, most people who harbor some kind of anti-Semitic views are not going to go out and shoot up a synagogue. They're not going to go out and, beat up a kid on a bus. But the number of those incidents shows what the tip of the iceberg is. So we were trying to get a sense of, that famous question you can't necessarily ask people, are you an anti-Semite? But you can ask people, how many of your neighbors do you think are anti-Semites, as a way of sort of getting at the sense. We asked people, do you believe Jews are at risk of violence and Jews are at risk of hate speech? And as you see, about 40%, 4 out of 10 people across Europe said, yes, we believe our, Jewish fellow citizens are at risk of violence and hate speech because they see it happening around them.
And the reality is, you talk about Pittsburgh, and I was on the air the next day, and there was, of course, as everything becomes a polarized political discussion, is somehow Donald Trump responsible because this is someone who shot up the place and was relying on these, bogus arguments about immigrants. And I brought up the point, I said, look, we can have this discussion if we're going to have it in a really inclusive way of all the potential elements, including social media. And the fact that social media is a toxic space for people, for these kinds of opinions of white nationalists and anti-Zionists to flourish. And when you had someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who runs Facebook, saying, well, we shouldn't necessarily ban Holocaust deniers from Facebook because that's opinion. But anything that's demonstrably false, that should be off the platform. When this was what
this is what I argue.
I went to war over.
Exactly. When people say they're facts and their opinions, I argue that in relation to Holocaust denial, they're facts, their opinions, and their lies. That was what my trial was all about. It was to show that these are absolute lies. These are not opinions. There are many things you can have opinions about in regard to the Holocaust. Within this building, you will find books and scholars who believe what motivated Hitler, what was his driving force. There are differences of opinion. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a field of study, but not whether it happened or not. And that's a striking part of it. But the idea of anti-Semitism being an opinion, or racism being an opinion, or Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. Because if you were to ask a denier, well, why did the Jews make up this story? They would say, what did the Jews, and I put this in very big quotation marks, get out of the Holocaust? They would say, what they got out of the Holocaust was a state, Israel, which of course is, I think, a very simplistic way of looking at the creation of the state of Israel, but that's the popular perception. And they got reparations, which is a fancy word for money. And then how were they able to spread this myth? They were able to spread it because they convinced the Allies to hold Nuremberg trials, to plant documents. They convinced Germany to accept responsibility for this terrible crime. So there you have the template that we've been talking about.
Right.
Finance, power, and exerting, and intellect, conniving ability to do it. So it's that same kind of thing. So anti-Semitism is not an opinion. It's a hatred, it's a lie, it's a prejudice, as is the case with racism and so many others.
And I was just going to quickly jump in. If we could have that slide back, when you talk about the anti-Semites, when you ask the anti-Semites why would they make this up, why would they invent this thing, You know, the slide that we're seeing now, this is a question that we asked, again, 7,000 Europeans in September of last year, 6 months ago. Do you believe Jews use the Holocaust to advance their own positions or goals? A third of them said yes. 1 out of 3 said, yes, I believe the Jews use the Holocaust to advance their own goals.
And yet, in other parts of the poll, were you surprised at how few people knew about the Holocaust?
Well, this was the, to say in this museum of all places, the shock for us. We asked an open-ended question, how much would you say that you know about the Holocaust? 1 out of 20 people said, I've never heard of the Holocaust. 1 out of 20 people, and I'll just quickly rattle off, we're talking about Germany, Austria, Poland, Hungary, Sweden, France, and Great Britain. And 1 out of 20 people said, I've never heard of the Holocaust. And then a third said, I know very little about it.
So Deborah, we want to talk about anti-Semitism today in Europe, but start in America. So we see white nationalists, and you've described some of this. A lot of that's Nazi ideology and racism. On the left, it's Zionists, right? It's the issue of Israel. There's an episode in your book that, you know, where then candidate Barack Obama got into a lot of hot water because of his minister, Jeremiah Wright, who was a pastor in Chicago, who had a lot of views, including anti-Semitic views, and said, oh, well, the Jews won't let, you know, Obama near me anymore. And he said, it's not just the Jews. He said, it's really the Zionists.
Right.
And I think that crystallized the idea that it's that a lot of progressives think the issue is Israel, it's the Zionists, and they would separate that out from saying, no, we're not anti-Semitic, we're going after Israel.
Well, you get this feeling, as you say, I'm not an anti-Semite, I'm only against Israel, or critical of Israeli policies. Look, being critical of Israeli policies is not the equivalent of anti-Semitism, and I think any Israeli diplomat would acknowledge that. You want to see criticism of Israeli policies, read Haaretz, on a day, the Hebrew daily, the Hebrew language daily, or go to the Knesset, and if you can hear what they're saying, because they're always yelling at each other, but you'll see criticism of Israeli policies. Israel's going through an election now, deep criticism of policies. We're not talking about criticism of policies. We're talking about a myopic concern with Israel as the source of all evil in the world, as Israel as the source of all wrongs, a singular focus, and not a focus on Saudi Arabia or China or whatever it might be, or a focus on, look, there were wrongs in the creation of Israel. We know that many of the Arab residents of then Palestine left because their leaders said to them, get out, you'll be back in 5 days, and we'll get rid of the Jews, and we won't have to worry about killing you because you won't be there, and you'll have all their property, etc. But some left, and many, I don't know the number of which is more, but because the Jewish fighters pushed them out. It's been documented in many historical books. So people will say, well, look at the crimes committed in the creation of the state of Israel. It doesn't have a right to exist. When someone says that to me, I say, you know, that's a good point, but let's put it in a broader context. Let's look at some of the crimes in the creation of other countries. The United States, we have 2 major crimes, the treatment of the Native Americans and slavery. Or let's look at Canada, what they call the first citizens in Canada, the treatment of indigenous Canadian, or people who lived there before it was Canada, or Australia and the treatment of, so there's a myopic concern. Or even in discussion of the problems in the Middle East, and Israel, I think, has, in many respects, has made bad decisions. I'm not responsible, I'm not the ones making them, but I think some of them have not been great decisions. But a myopic view of it's all Israel and it's never the other side. When you begin to see this myopia, you have to ask why. What's going on here? And I think for some people, Israel becomes the screen behind which you can hide your anti-Semitism. There was a British member of the House of Lords named Jenny Tong, I think it is, who the day of Pittsburgh tweeted, this is outrageous, but when will Bibi Netanyahu recognize that his policies lead to no good? Or I'm paraphrasing. Pittsburgh, the guys yelling about immigrants and the hordes of brown people that Jews are facilitating to bring it to, what's the connection? You know, or you criticize someone for their anti-Semitism. Oh, you just want to shut me up. We see this in the British Labour Party. We see it in this country, too, because of my views on Israel. I'm not saying that, and again, I feel, you know, sometimes I worry in the Shakespearean sense, we think the gentlewoman doth protest too much, but I'm not saying that you can't criticize. Of course you can criticize, and of course people do criticize. But when it's a myopia, when it's a singular focus, when it's a singular focus on one side, I think then you have to ask what else may be driving this.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, is that just more of a modern phenomenon as it relates to anti-Semitism, or do you find that going on in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s as well?
I think you see it much more now.
Okay, so my question would be why.
Pre-67, Israel was weak, and, you know, no one knew was the state going to exist. I mean, there are Israelis who remember the 50s when there was not enough food in Israel. If you've ever visited Israel, the thought there isn't enough food for people to exist is you know, it seems oxymoronic. So I think once Israel becomes more, particularly after 67, more of a power, a military power, a political power, there's a different perspective. And I think you also, and I do trace this in the book, you can't ignore the role of the, to my mind, late unlamented USSR in creating this. They were the ones who created this notion of Zionism as racism, which of course makes no sense, again, because over 50% of the Israeli population are people of color, you know, so but pushing this idea. So even once the USSR is no longer there, those ideas are still out there, and you see them.
So Richard, what's happening, what are you seeing journalistically, and as you poll these, what's happening in Europe? How and why are we seeing anti-Semitism reassert itself and reemerge?
Well, I guess one thing that I would say is, worrying as our findings are, particularly about anti-Semitism, they exist in a context, I think, in Europe, as they do in the United States, of prejudice, intolerance, of fear of minorities, of immigrants, of Muslims, in a very broad sense. So in our, you know, we're seeing. I'm just going to pause and let people watch this for a minute. This is, we went out and we did a series of television packages around the polling, and we found, you know, people openly doing Nazi salutes on the streets of Germany today. Certainly in the Arab world, you see very open anti-Semitism. We've heard the obviously, you know, some of the more horrifying attacks. You know, of the kind that we saw in Pittsburgh were happening in Europe 5, 10 years ago. But I do want to say this exists in a context of prejudice in general. You know, we asked about other groups as well. And as I said, 10% of people were willing to flat out say they don't like Jews. 16% of people were willing to say they don't like gay people. 36% of people were willing to say they don't like immigrants. 37% were willing to say they don't like Muslims. 39% were willing to say they don't like Roma gypsies. So this is, you know, it is the tip of an iceberg to say that there's anti-Semitism out there. There is. There's anti-gay prejudice. There's anti-immigrant prejudice. There's Islamophobia. There's, you know, certainly historically, Europe has a real problem with Roma.
What this slide,
what we're seeing is what we're seeing on the top, the white, is people who say they have a favorable opinion of that group, and below, an unfavorable opinion of that group. Is what we're seeing there.
You know, one of the things I say, and I say it in the conclusion of the book, but I've been saying it for years, that no healthy democratic society can tolerate anti-Semitism in its midst and be considered a healthy democratic society. If you're going to fight this, don't just fight it because, you know, you worry about your Jewish neighbors or you yourself are a Jew. That's a good reason, but it's not a sufficient reason. And don't just fight it because you can't abide any kind of prejudice. That's a good reason, but not a sufficient reason. But if you worry about the health of a democratic society, this is a sign of something terribly amiss. And it may start with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. And I think that's what this study is so profoundly shows.
And Deborah, what are you finding that's coursing through Europe that's so particular now?
I think it depends. If you look at Western Europe or Eastern, or the former Central Europe, but you find, first of all, certain political leaders who are willing to play on this and build on this. I talk about Viktor Orban in Hungary, to a certain degree, the leading party in Poland now, AfD in Germany, which you showed us in the slides, and maybe some were not members of AfD, but certainly Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party. But you also find
Which is the third largest party in parliament.
Thank you,
Germany.
right. Repeat that.
Is the third largest party in the German parliament.
Right, a party that wouldn't have been imagined in Germany 10 years ago is now the third largest party in Germany. And you see it in Italy. You see this right-wing sort of anti-globalist, anti-EU, anti-Muslim immigrants, because that's part of it. And on a bedrock of anti-Semitism, the Jews are pushing this on us. The Jews are the globalists. Soros has become the Rothschild of the 21st century. You see this on the right, and then you see it, as we were talking about, on the left. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party is a prime example on the left of the refusal to take anti-Semitism seriously. What you see on the left, and Corbyn is a good example, but we also have examples in this country of a similar sentiment in other places as well, is for some progressives, not all, I'm not condemning progressivism in general, but for some progressives, certainly people around Corbyn, their view of prejudice is refracted through a prism. And you remember from basic physics, a prism refracts, bends light, bends what you're seeing. And that prism has two facets. It has an economic facet and it has an ethnic facet. So I look at the person claiming to be a victim of prejudice, and I see a white person, even though people on the right don't consider you white, as we saw in Pittsburgh, and I see a Jew, ipso facto, a person of privilege. And a person who is white and a person who is a person of privilege cannot claim to be a victim of prejudice. It's impossible. Therefore, they must be doing this for some other reason. And that's where you often have the fallback for defense of Israel and that kind of thing, or for some other reason. So it's a refusal to take anti-Semitism seriously. And you know where you also see this? Where I make my home, on many American college campuses, where you can ask, I don't think every campus is a hotbed of anti-Semitism. I don't think we have to, guard our students, give them, defense mechanisms, et cetera. Jewish life on many a campus is thriving, Jewish studies and social life, et cetera, et cetera. But amongst many faculty, graduate students, you talk to them about anti-Semitism and their eyes glaze over. What are you talking about? This is you're people of privilege. You're white. You can pass. You can choose to pass. As a person of color, cannot make that choice. This is crazy. You must have some other ulterior motive. Plus, and again, we see this on the left. Corbyn is a prime example, and those around him, but not just him. Moi, to quote that famous philosopher, Miss Piggy. Me, an anti-Semite, I absorb progressive values with my mother's milk. Jeremy Corbyn will tell you his mother marched at Cable Street, the famous anti-fascist marches in England in the 30s. how could you possibly say I'm prejudiced? It's impossible. Therefore, you must have an ulterior purpose. So you turn it around.
And I just think we have to say, to lay it all out there, we've talked about progressive anti-Semitism. We also have a president of the United States, Donald Trump, who is very clearly pro-Israel and who has done a lot for Israel, and controversially so, moving the embassy and whatnot. But he's also absolutely trafficked in anti-Semitic tropes. He did it in the campaign, speaking to a Jewish audience, saying, "Who negotiates better deals than you?" Renegotiate, and you won't vote for me because I don't want your money, suggesting that Jews use their money to control the politicians they get. His campaign had the ad with Hillary Clinton and the stacks of money and the Jewish star in the background. And as a social media presence, he's one of the biggest people out there, and has retweeted. You make the point in the book that he has, in your view, facilitated the spread of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I think, here again, and I'm going to be equal opportunity defender as I am, or accuser, take Trump and Corbyn. I don't know, two men who have very different political worldviews. I don't know if either of them is anti-Semites. I tend to think, certainly in terms of Donald Trump, not. I think he's very proud of his Jewish daughter, Jewish son-in-law, Jewish grandchildren, etc. But, and again, I don't know what's in Corbyn's heart, but both men have facilitated anti-Semitism. In Yiddish terminology, they would have called it a Kochlöffel. Those German, a cooking spoon, stirring up the pot. They've used tropes, they've used themes, talking about nice people on both sides. Right. Corbyn refusing to recognize an overtly anti-Semitic mural as anti-Semitic. So it doesn't matter to me what's in someone's heart. That's between them and their cardiologist, It's irrelevant. It's what they do. And don't tell me some of your best friends are. I remember as a child, I was in a store with my father, and either the man knew he was Jewish, or my father said something about not being able to come in on Saturday to pick it up because it was the Shabbat, or whatever it was. And the man said, "Oh, Mr. Lipstadt, some of my best friends are Jews." We walked out of the store. I said, "Oh, that's so nice, Daddy, that some of his best friends are Jews." My father said to me, "Did you ever hear anyone boast that some of their best friends are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants?" In other words, if you're boasting about having Jewish friends or black friends or gay friends, what you're saying is, look at me, I'm so terrific. I have some of these people for my friends, the good ones.
But I think, Richard...
And I was just going to say, I love the line in your... spoiler, I've read Deborah's book, which you all should. I love the line in your book that a Philo-Semite is an anti-Semite who likes Jews.
Yeah.
That's Frank Foyer's line, but it's a great line.
But Richard, what this points to me, and I think one of the real drivers of this kind of discussion is not just to understand the history, but to put a proper frame around the debate. One of the things that I think we do horribly in social media discussion is not just that we don't do nuance, is that we're not really contributing to much understanding. If you get into a debate about, I cannot stand what Israel's doing for X and Y and Z reason, and then that's it. The response is, oh, well, clearly you hate the Jews. Instead of decoupling those things. And at the same time saying to a congresswoman, if you want to suggest that Jews have all the money and that's why they're the driving force behind our government's support for Israel, that's kind of a conversation stopper. The point is because you're trafficking in tropes. It doesn't matter what's in your heart. It's understanding what the frame of this conversation is so that you can be accurate, so you cannot offend, so you cannot be willfully ignorant, which is what we are being told in our other enlightened conversations we ought to be aware of, to not use dog whistles. And again, we spend time in social media, God help us, and that's where these conversations are so unproductive.
Absolutely. And in fact, Germany's anti-Semitism czar spoke to us as part of our reporting series. Germany has now appointed a government official to monitor and fight anti-Semitism. And he told us how concerned he was about what's going on in social media and how people feel very free to say there things that they would never say in public or that they would never say in a bar. I don't know if we have that clip queued up, but it was a very powerful moment.
Germany has acknowledged it has a problem, recently appointing its first anti-Semitism czar. Felix Klein is focused on creating a nationwide system for reporting anti-Semitic crimes and on improving integration of Germany's different communities.
Anti-Semitism has always existed in Germany, also after 1945, and now, though, it is showing its ugly face more openly. Things that people would never have dared to say in a bar or in a restaurant, in a private surrounding, do so now using social media or the net.
No, it's
not something that we're experiencing only here in the United States, certainly,
Absolutely.
the toxic effects of social media.
Let's get to some of your questions as well, and Brendan, I'll start with you. Talking about you and your students, have you and your students encountered anti-Semitism in Europe during one of your visits with the Bearing Witness program?
Well, in fact, we have. A week from tomorrow, in fact, we're going on another trip to Europe to take my students. Again, we go to Munich, Prague, and Krakow, and yeah, here's an image. So on Bearing Witness 1, about 10 years ago, we had arrived here in Krakow, and we walked the grounds of what remains of Płaszów. This was the concentration camp central to the film Schindler's List. And there's nothing left of it other than some very important memorials, this being one of them. And upon our arrival, we were stunned to find that the memorial had been defaced with this graffiti. And it was done by a group of anti-Semites intentionally because earlier that morning, the Jewish community of Krakow was holding a memorial event. And so in the middle of the night, 3 hours before the event was to begin, they had come upon the grounds and defaced this memorial. And my students are 16 years old, high school kids, and they were devastated. They were shocked to see this. And upon our return, we had come back to the States just days later. They became resolved to do something about this. And so they penned a letter to the mayor of Krakow, simply just to express outrage over this. And I was quite proud of them for doing that. Very powerful letter. And he wrote back, which was interesting. But yes, to your question, yes, of course. We have seen several examples of contemporary...
What did he say in reply?
What did he say?
What did he say?
Well, first and foremost, he thanked them. He did point out that he found it remarkable that a group of U.S. Catholic students from Atlanta would be so moved by this defacement that they would feel compelled to write. So he was sort of lauding them for taking action or otherwise responding to this, which I thought was important.
Deborah, what's the role of governments, of special envoys like the U.S. Special Envoy, like the representative in Germany, to combat anti-Semitism?
I think it's an important role, but again, as I mentioned, it's important but not sufficient. It's an important role that governments speak out, that governments look at what's going on educationally. That you know, I was in Sweden 2 weeks ago as a guest of a government institution for Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I happened to be in conversation with the rabbi of the great synagogue in the center of Sweden, of Stockholm, and she told me that she has members of her congregation who are school teachers, and they teach not in central Stockholm but in some of the peripheral areas, and indicating that the areas where there are a lot of new immigrants or new citizens, and I think they call them new residents, I forget the exact terms the Swedes use, but they never will mention that they're Jews. Not to their students, because they know their students will not, when they teach about World War II, will not listen to them. Some of the parents will ask to have them moved. These are primarily Muslim refugees. Again, I'm not saying this is global, but they've gone underground. Or I've heard from friends in Belgium who, one woman told me she asked her children to wear them. She was very embarrassed. She said, I was embarrassed to ask my children to put their Magen David, their Star of David, under their shirt instead of over their shirt. She said, but I was relieved when they did it. So governments have to be looking at what's going on. We've seen the past few days what's gone on in France. There is a role for governments to look at educational systems, to look at other things that are going on structurally. But it's not enough, because then it's a top-down. There has to be a sense of outrage and a sense of what I was saying earlier, of fear. What's wrong with our society that this is happening here? What's wrong in France that this is happening here? Where have we gone wrong? It's got to come from both ends. If it doesn't come from both ends, it's not going to work. It certainly is not going to work if Jews are the only ones concerned about it.
Right, it's the idea that, people grab on and reach out for anti-Semitism because it's millennia old, and instead of recognizing, look, in my own life, how shocked I've been at the modern manifestations of anti-Semitism. I'm Jewish, but my last name is Gregory. My father changed his name from Ginsburg to Gregory. He married an Irish Catholic woman. I have to self-identify as a Jew. And so when I encountered anti-Semitism, and it's been in more sparing, often I've been exposed to it without it being directed at me, unlike my father. That was such a revelation. And in a way, I thought it was, some of these claims of anti-Semitism were overdone until you start bearing witness to what's all around us, and you realize that though this is, somebody asked a question here: what's the role for all of us? I think it's we've got to have some constructive conversation with people in our lives, not just about anti-Semitism. It's about politics. I mean, what is the lesson from what just happened in Chicago with this actor from Empire? Things are not always what they seem. That's the point. We're so quick to rush to judgment, to believe in conspiracy theories. My wife prosecuted the Oklahoma City bombers. To this day, there are some people who believe that there was a John Doe too, somebody who's out there running around who was responsible for the bombing. It doesn't make sense if you know the evidence. We have to challenge each other to say, what you're talking about doesn't make sense, and let's get into it.
No, I think that is crucial. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book. And I wrote it in what I hope is an accessible fashion, with lots of scholarship, but in a way that speaks to a general audience, because it's so important not to just say, that's wrong, or I don't like that, or that makes me feel uncomfortable, but what is it, and when is it inappropriate, and when is it just an obnoxious statement, and when is it an obnoxious anti-Semitic statement?
A couple of questions about Great Britain and what's happening in the Labour Party on the left. How do you see that in the context of the problem of anti-Semitism?
Well, I mean, extraordinary for me to be packing to come on this trip on Monday, and suddenly my phone starts beeping, and I'm hearing that 7 members of the Labour Party have resigned because of blatant, uncontrollable anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. It can't be more contemporary than that. That's what happened on Monday, and then what happened on Tuesday was Jewish gravestones defaced with swastikas in France, and I, was here yesterday preparing for the program, and the photograph on the front page of the Wall Street Journal is Emmanuel Macron at the cemetery with, looking at swastikas on tombstones. So, for a long time, I've lived in Europe for about 25 years now, more than 25 years. And, you see things ebb and flow. I have friends who have been covering, Jewish life in Europe for many years. And one of them says to me, she said to me a couple of months ago, this thought that anti-Semitism has never been so bad in Europe since the war is a little bit crazy when you think synagogues were being bombed in Rome in the 70s. Right? It ebbs and it flows, and I think it seems very worrying right now. It would be foolish to ignore what we're seeing, but it's not the whole story.
Yeah, but I think, yes, there were bombings of synagogues in Rome and bombings of synagogues in Paris and in Istanbul. But
in Atlanta?
In Atlanta in the 50s, right? In the 60s, excuse me. And we've seen that. But I think what we're seeing now has a different feel, and not just because we're experiencing it now. I think we're seeing, maybe in part facilitated by social media, but not social media alone, a spread whether it's knocking over tombstones, whether it's actual violence, a willingness to express it. An AfD, which as you point out is the third most powerful party, I would argue that there's something qualitatively different than what we saw earlier. And it's in Brooklyn, and it's in Paris, and it's in Toulouse, and it's in Berlin, and it's in Belgium, and one sort of facilitates the other, in that sense.
But you also caution in the book those who would say, oh, is this a return? I mean, is this what it was like? I've had people come up to me who hate the president and make these leaps to Nazi Germany. I just say, stop it. I said, that's just ahistorical. And you make yourself sound ignorant when you say things like that.
No, I think that glib comparisons to Nazi Germany don't serve any purpose and are historically wrong. There are things to compare, attacks on democratic institution, attacks on judges, attacks on Department of Justice, various and sundry things.
The press.
And the press, thank you, absolutely. And it's worrisome. But it's worrisome in and of itself, and not because it portends, a Third Reich or something like that. And I think those kind of comparisons don't help the conversation.
But there's a comment that was made by somebody in the audience that I just want to read because I think it's insightful. Social media has been mentioned as the greatest weapon in orchestrating anti-Semitism. I don't know if it's maybe by some, among them, yeah. The youth, however, don't really view social media in such a negative light, and often the youth don't understand the meaning behind certain symbols or words because they were never taught the importance and feel it has nothing to do with them. They feel detachment. How can people use social media to educate and get rid of that detachment? And I want to underline that because I think it's really important. I think that there's people, there's things I'm still learning about anti-Semitism and some of the tropes and some of the symbols. I think that's true with racism. I mean, I have kids who listen to rap music, and we've had conversations about, well, can I sing a song that includes the N-word? And I said, well, no, you can't, and let's have a conversation about that. But if you're 15 years old, that word doesn't have the power that it does for us, because you're conditioned differently. You hear it all the time, used in different ways. And so I think just that pure educational piece becomes so important.
What something represents.
Yeah. Any comment on that?
Well, I think, and I'd look to you because of your involvement in the media. I'm wary of condemning or blaming it all on social media. First of all, it's too easy. Second of all, I don't think there's anybody in this room, whether it's in their personal or their professional life, I know certainly in writing this book about contemporary issues, who doesn't rely on social media. The comparison I use, and I think I have it in the book, is social media is like a knife. A knife in the hands of a murderer is a weapon. The knife in the hands of a surgeon will save your life. It's how you use it. And I think we have this gift of social media, this gift of the internet, this gift of being able to educate ourselves about various things. But with it comes a responsibility of how we use it.
And this gets to the whole point about how these communities, because you made a point before, Richard, about, so there's connective tissue that is born of community. And I think that for instance, the political left in this country got a lot more connected, say in opposition to the Iraq War, but it didn't happen until about 2005, after the re-election of President Bush. And social media has connected, whether you see it in cable news, these are communities of largely like-minded people who are watching a news source. And then through social media, you have to believe a lot of action, desecration of Jewish cemeteries and the like, in part comes from a sense of, hey, I'm part of something, and the movement is connected because all I have to do is go on to Facebook or Twitter, and I can find people who think like I do. And that's the power of it, and that's the danger of it. So, Deborah, this question, how do you explain times when anti-Semitism appears to decrease? And what are the circumstances and reasons behind a decline in anti-Semitism?
I sometimes describe anti-Semitism as a herpes virus. It's disgusting, but it's actually, I think, rather accurate. Until recently, now there's apparently medication which can cure herpes, but until recently, if you got a herpes, it never went away. It was always there, and it could come out at times of tension. We all know the horror stories of the bride who wakes up on the morning of her wedding and has got a cold sore, or the person going for an interview and gets an attack of one form or another. I think of anti-Semitism as like a herpes virus that will emerge at times of tension, and when I don't want to say that because that's a passive sentence, will be used by people who want to explain away the tension, drive up the tension, enhance the tension. Here's a good weapon. We saw it in the 1930s. We see it today. We've seen it before. So I think that's part of the issue. I think one of the things we have to do, many things we have to do. We have to call it out. We have to recognize it. We have to understand it. We have to respond to it. We have to become the unwelcome guests at the dinner party. Don't say, oh, this person is coming, we know he's a racist, an anti-Semite, a misogynist, but we're going to be quiet because we want a nice dinner party. We can't afford to do that in this day and age. We can't afford to do it because we're not going to change his mind or her mind, but because of the message it telegraphs to the people around us, that either we agree with it, or even if we disagree, we remain silent. Silence is not an option.
That's such a great point. And along with that, to stand up to it, but to have an ability to be in conversation with someone. Again, so much of community conversation that is in the digital space, it's not conversation. It's yelling at each other, and you can do so anonymously, and that's not real conversation. So to your point, the intimacy of a dinner party is where you say to somebody you might even like it, say, I got to call you out for saying this or believing it. It's really important. Thank you all very much. This has been a really important conversation. I'm so happy to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here. Thanks for those of you who are watching our live stream. One note, I want to let you know about the next program in the Hate and Its Impact series. Don't want to miss those conversations about hate and its impact. Nazi ideology and the Jim Crow South. It will explore what Nazi leaders learned from racist thoughts and practices in America's Jim Crow South, how racism and anti-Semitism were linked, and what the implications are today. That will be March the 12th at 1 p.m. here at the museum. Or you can also tune into the live stream. That's ushmm.org/watch. Thank you all very much.